This is a reading from Characters of the Reformation by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 18, Richelieu, the Confirmation of Protestantism in Europe. Of all the public characters who molded Europe during the 17th century, Richelieu is both the greatest in himself and the most important in the effect he had. He perpetuated in France the presence of a Huguenot, that is, a Protestant, minority among the wealthier classes, and he confirmed the independence of Protestant Germany, initiating the breakdown of Catholic authority represented by the Emperor at Vienna. In other words, it was Richelieu's genius more than any other factor which led to the great battle ending in a draw, and to a Europe from one half of which the Catholic culture was to be permanently excluded. Most people would still say, being asked what was Richelieu's life's work, the consolidation of the French nation through the strengthening of the French monarchy. That was certainly his intention. It was certainly the object to which he himself was devoted. Everything else he did was subsidiary to that in his own mind. But the fruits of a man's work are never those which he expects. There is always some side effect which will seem, after a certain lapse of time, to be the principal one. A man wins a battle in order to obtain a crown, and the result, unexpected by himself, is a change of language over a wide district. A man protects some oppressed people and liberates them from their oppressor, and the result, unexpected to himself, and coming perhaps 100 years later, is the conquest of his own people by those whom he had befriended. A man raises a rebellion to establish democracy, and the result is government by a financial oligarchy. So it was with Richelieu. The only thing he cared about was giving the French people political unity, which could only be done by making the king strong. He succeeded, but the result was to leave the French morally divided between Catholicism and its enemies, while the much larger indirect result, which has affected the whole world, was the creation of a firmly planted Protestant North Germany, typified today by the power of Prussia. And all this power has meant during the last 150 years. The way Richelieu set about this task of strengthening the French people was as follows. He had noticed how during his own youth, the great nobles, and especially the great Protestant nobles, were blackmailing and weakening the crown after the assassination of Henry IV. The worst culprit was old Sully, who went off with enormous loot as the fruit of threats to aid civil war against the Queen Regent. The king, the heir of Henry IV, was only a boy under the title of Louis XIII. Until he should be of age, his mother, Marie de Medici, a violent but unpractical woman, was left in control. The result was that the rich could do pretty well what they liked. The Protestant nobles and the large Protestant middle class of the towns took full advantage of this position. It will be remembered that Henry IV, by the Edict of Nantes, had allowed them to hold a number of strong walled cities and to govern them as a sort of state within the state, and had also permitted them to call national assemblies of their faction, which were a perpetual menace to the central power of the king. Richelieu saw that the first thing to be done if the crown was to be saved, its power increased, and thereby the whole nation consolidated, was to take away these dangerous special favors and treat the Huguenots like everybody else. He was determined, when he came to power, that there should be no longer a realm within the realm, and a rival power strong enough to threaten the monarchy. But by so much as he was determined upon this, was he also determined upon the fullest toleration for Calvinism. Richelieu was the first of that long line of public men, from this day to ours, to treat religious difference as a private matter, and to believe that one can have a united country without unity of religion. James I of England, as we have seen, had some such idea at the back of his head, but he never really put it into practice, for the hatred and fear of the Catholic Church of the great landowners, his subjects, whose fortunes had come from the loot of the Church, was too strong for him. And what is more, the great landowners proved in the long run too strong for the English crown, and destroyed it, substituting their own two assemblies, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, known as Parliament, for the old popular kingship of England. Richelieu saw the menace, though it had not fully developed in his own time, and he was determined that France should follow the opposite course. It is therefore due to him not only that France became politically united as a strong monarchy, but also that the peasantry won the long battle with the noble classes and became the main owners of the soil of France, whereas in England, the noble classes, that is, the squires, ate up the peasantry and became the main owners of the soil themselves. Richelieu's most famous exploit in this reduction of the political power of the French Huguenots was the siege and capture of their strong town, the port of La Rochelle. To satisfy Protestant feeling in England, the King of England, Charles I, had tried to succor the place by sending the Duke of Buckingham there with a fleet and an army. Buckingham very nearly succeeded, and would have quite succeeded, for he was an excellent soldier and laid his plans well, not attacking the town directly, which would have been a task beyond his powers, but threatening it in flank by seizing the great island at the mouth of the harbor. But having such an opponent as Richelieu to face, he lost. La Rochelle was captured for the King of France, and the Huguenot political privileges were at an end. All the more was Calvinism tolerated as a religion. In that very lifetime which saw priests butchered in England, after the cruel fashion for which the Puritans were openly responsible during their period of war, Calvinism in Catholic France was perfectly free. It had no martyrs and suffered no persecution. Although its followers were a minority among the French people, they were a considerable proportion of the wealthy class, and it was from them that the anti-Catholic feeling among the French gradually developed. Their influence did not take the form of converting any further numbers to Calvinism, but of familiarizing masses of Frenchmen with a dislike of the Catholic Church, so that at long last, after ferment had been at work for a couple of centuries, the whole nation was divided upon the issue, and remains violently so divided to this day. This religious division is the principal source of French weakness at the present time. While Richelieu thus, without intending to do so, sowed the seeds of religious division in France, he, also without intending to do so, sowed the seeds of that much graver growth, the religious division of Europe. We have seen in what was said in the chapter concerning Gustavus Adolphus how the center of Europe was being recaptured for the faith. The government of the British Isles was Protestant, and the determining majority of the population of Great Britain was Protestant. But Ireland was Catholic, and there was a large Catholic minority in England. In Holland, there was a Calvinist government. There was a still larger Catholic minority. It was only in Scandinavia that you had a Protestant population with no appreciable Catholic resistance remaining, and no one could guess as yet that one of these ill-populated countries, to wit, Sweden, was going to produce a great military genius in Gustavus Adolphus. Long before Gustavus Adolphus appeared on the scene, Richelieu had watched with anxiety the increase of Catholicism in Germany, and the recapture of district after district for the faith, and he had watched what seems to us today so natural a matter for rejoicing in a Catholic statesman with anxiety, because he was thinking more of the power of his king than of the faith. To do him justice, he could not have conceived that Catholicism in Europe would ever be in serious danger. The Protestant nations were small and divided, and hardly seemed to him a menace. England had at the most a third and more probably not more than a quarter of the population and wealth of France. Holland still less. The three Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, less even than Holland. For large as Sweden and Norway between them look on the map, the most of their territory consists of uninhabitable mountains. Further, in the Germanies, Protestantism was represented by a number of separate states and small principalities, jealous of each other and able to afford no permanent resistance to the advancing power of the Catholic Emperor, who ruled from Vienna and was determined to make all Germany a united nation under his own rule. But such a nation would have been a menace to France, and Richelieu set out to prevent such unity from being accomplished. Now that this military genius, Gustavus Adolphus, had appeared unexpectedly like a meteor in the international world, he realized the opportunity, and we saw in the last article how he hired Gustavus to be his soldier against Austria. Gustavus was defeated and killed in the very nick of time. For Richelieu, a little more, and he might have restored a united Germany of another sort. As it was, when he died, he had saved Protestantism, but had not extended its boundaries. Richelieu, who had now become seriously alarmed at the unexpected magnitude of his prodigious success, felt free again. But even as it was, the challenge which he had thrown down to Austria was very nearly the ruin of his plans. The huge Spanish Empire was governed by another branch of the same family, as that which ruled the Catholic German Empire, the family who took their name from the castle of Habsburg. The Habsburg ruling in Spain was the cousin of the Habsburg ruling in Vienna. Part of the Spanish Empire in those days was the country now called Belgium. The Spaniards had far greater money resources than the French in the early 17th century, and though Spanish power was declining, no one suspected how far that decline had gone, for it was from within. The external appearance was still magnificent. They came very near to a decisive and crushing victory over the French, but they failed. Richelieu maintained French power victoriously until his death, and the chief result of his policy was the falling in of Alsace under the French monarchy. The nobles and free cities in that wholly German-speaking plain lying between the Vosges and the Rhine were divided, about 1/3 being for the Protestant cause and about 2/3 for the Catholic. But no one there wanted to be under the emperor, and one of Richelieu's Protestant allies, who was fighting the emperor, having been killed just after he had captured Brissac, the key fortress on which Alsace depended, his army was persuaded to solve its difficulties by offering the government of Alsace to the King of France. It was not a bad bargain for the Alsatians, all of whose local liberties remained, and who came nearer to enjoying self-government over the space of a century and a half than they were likely to come under either of the two rivals on the other side of the Rhine, the emperor or his Protestant opponents. Richelieu died in 1642, having seen all his schemes come to success. They came late. He could not be certain of his triumph until the very last years of his life. Even as his last sickness was upon him, when he was a dying man, it still looked as though the Spaniards in the south might be too strong for the French, although their attack from Belgium had been defeated. But by the actual moment of his death, Richelieu knew that he had conquered everywhere. What he did not know, but what the Pope of the day foresaw rather vaguely, was that the triumph of the French cardinal meant also the permanent establishment of Protestant power in Europe.